participation button on the lower right, they will be able to see themselves and the presenter. And also, when you want to address questions, Ron will take them throughout his presentation. And that button is also located on the lower right. Thank you very much. And Ron, with further ado, we're tossing the time over to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Janet, and thank you all of the participants. What an honor it is to spend a few minutes with you this morning. I hope that I have something valuable for you, some valuable information, some valuable experiences. Let me just take a few minutes to introduce myself. My name is Ron Tolman, and I am an accountant, a forensic accountant for a company called Stag Fiduciary Services. And we do a lot of conservatorships and trusts. We handle a lot of estates. We serve as Social Security rep payee in many cases. We're a private company. We're not a government agency. Often our clients come from government agencies, from fraud-related circumstances where somebody other than the current person handling this person's finances needs to be put in place. The courts often will appoint us to fill those capacities. Adult Protective Services from time to time will refer cases to us. So my background, I've been an accountant for a little over 20 years. And I make the joke that when I was in college, remember those of you that went to college in the 90s or the 80s, remember those big fat college catalogs that they would give you before you signed up. And I always make the joke that I didn't want to read the whole thing, so I opened to the first page. The first thing was accountant, so that's what I did. But in reality, I was taking a business class at Salt Lake Community College, and it was Accounting 101. And I noticed that not very many people in the class enjoyed being there, and not very many people thought that that was too fun of a subject. So I didn't mind it, and I enjoyed it, and I figured, well, if everybody else hates it and every business needs an accountant, then maybe that's a good career for me. So I went into accounting. So like I said, I've been doing general accounting for about 20 years. About 13 years ago, I began working for Stag Fiduciary Services, and I began doing forensic and fiduciary accounting. And I've specialized since that time in elder financial abuse cases and disability financial abuse cases. I studied business and accounting at Salt Lake Community College. I also studied business and economics at Brigham Young University. And in 2014, about 7 years ago, I became certified as a CFE, a certified fraud examiner. So that's a little bit about me. I have this all on one of my slides, but I thought maybe you would like to see my face as I'm introducing myself. So I'm going to switch to my presentation now. If I can find my mouse. There it is. And we'll skip that slide because I just shared all of that. So again, welcome. If you have questions that are relevant to what we're talking at the moment, please feel free to put the questions out there. One of the monitors will be alerting me if a question pops up. I don't know if I'll be able to see them, but we'll answer questions in real time if they're relevant to what we're talking about at the moment. I'll also try to save about 10 minutes at the end for questions if you have just general questions. Let's see. All right, identifying and resolving elder financial abuse. Here's my introduction. I think I've already gone through that, so we'll move on. One thing I wanted to mention is that today I'm not going to be focusing on identity theft or scams or that type of thing, which is very common fraud that seniors and the elderly experience. My focus is going to be on fraud from those in close relationships with the victim. There is the Utah Department of Aging and Adult Services has put together a packet called Safe and Smart Protecting Yourself from Financial Exploitation and Scams. They cover a little bit of the close relationship fraud, but they go more into depth as well with scams and identity theft that seniors experience. I would recommend that any caregiver or any person working with seniors have a copy of that pamphlet. In that pamphlet, they state that scammers are not the only abusers. 55% of financial exploitation cases involve a family member as the abuser. And that's generally the cases that I see and generally what I work with. There's, in addition to family, sometimes caregivers are the exploiter, sometimes professionals or friends. My objective here is I've got three different things I wanted to cover. First, I wanted to go through a couple of elder abuse financial cases. I wanted to then look at some of the responsibilities that we as caregivers or people who work at senior centers or people who have day-to-day contact with seniors, responsibilities that you have, and also some strategies that you can use to intervene if you see something that's amiss. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is how to avoid financial elder abuse. Often, by the time it's found and identified, the damage is done and it's very difficult to repair or reverse. And some people are harmed permanently financially because of that. So really being able to see the signs early on and avoid the financial abuse is the best option, both for your clients, both for the people you work with, and also for yourselves and your own family members. So I have two sample cases I wanted to review, and I believe there's some in the audience from Adult Protective Services. I did a training with Adult Protective Services a few years back, and I received some feedback that on my case studies, I had mixed a few different scenarios and kind of put them into not a fictional case, but a case that was representative of multiple different scenarios. And I got the feedback that wasn't preferred. So the cases I'm going to cover today are actual cases, and all of the facts and all of the results are specific to that case and not commingling multiple cases to make an example. The first case I want to look at is we're gonna call this person Jenny. Jenny is the perpetrator. That's obviously not this person's real name. And in this particular case, there was a minor child, an 18-year-old, that was disabled in an accident. And you might be saying, wait a minute, I thought we were talking about elder financial abuse. I work with disability financial abuse cases as well. And the facts and circumstances in this particular case are common, regardless of the age of the person. I see similar things happen to the elderly. So I thought this would be a good one. So The minor child received a settlement with workers' compensation, and workers' compensation put those funds into a special needs trust. And the parent, one of the parents of the trust, of the minor, was put in as the trustee. That parent was also actually appointed by Social Security as Social Security disability rep payee for the minor. So the facts of the case, the trustee commingled the funds. Jenny put the trust funds, mixed them with her own bank account, with her own funds, paid items for both the minor and for the trust and for her own personal use, all out of the same account. She didn't track the usage of the funds very well, if at all, and failed to provide to the interested parties, which would be the beneficiary of the trust, which in this case was the minor child, who, by the way, I remember I said this happened at about just before he turned 18. So soon after the trust was created, he was no longer a minor child, but all of his funds were tied up in this trust. The trustee, Jenny, could not prove that the funds were being used for the benefit of the beneficiary. Jenny used the funds for things like travel for the entire family. In fact, there was a large trip that the family took, and at the last minute, the beneficiary of the trust decided that he had too much anxiety, or for various reasons decided not to go on the trip, but the trip was paid for anyway with the funds of the trust, even though the beneficiary of the trust didn't even benefit or participate in that. And again, this trustee could not prove that the funds were being used for the benefit of the beneficiary, and did make an attempt to do so. Lots of expenditures were made, fuel for vehicles, repairs for vehicles that didn't belong to the beneficiary, meals for people that were obviously more than just the beneficiary. In this particular case, the way that the fraud was discovered is that the child, the beneficiary, he noticed that something was wrong. He couldn't explain it. He didn't really have, he had a traumatic brain injury was part of his injuries, and he just couldn't understand what exactly was wrong, but he did know enough to notice that something was wrong. And this is key when we're talking a little bit later about how to identify and how to, how to help avoid is a lot of times it starts with the gut feeling of somebody and to act on the gut feeling. In this particular case, it was the child that felt something was off. And he went to Social Security and requested a new Social Security rep payee. He did not want his mother to be the rep payee anymore. His mother, which was the rep payee to begin with, was unable to obtain, or the new rep payee was unable to obtain any explanation from the old rep payee, the mother, how the funds were used. And so this rep payee, who happened to be an attorney, the new rep payee, initiated action in the probate court to find out, have this looked into a little bit further. So the resolution of this case was that the probate court appointed a new trustee over the trust funds. And the court ordered at the same time a 3-year forensic accounting. And that's what we did, is we went back and we looked at financial records and bank records. That's when we determined that the funds had been commingled and didn't see where the funds were being used for the beneficiary. The court ultimately ruled that the funds were misused and that they were commingled. Jenny, the mother, was ordered to repay the funds. And you remember the comment I made at the beginning that often by the time it's discovered, it's you know, it's very difficult to recover the funds. It's very difficult. You know, sometimes it can't be fixed and it can't be resolved. In this case, there was a criminal case or a civil case, and the funds were ordered to be repaid, and a judgment was ordered by the court. But by this time, there was very little funds left, and the funds that had been, there wasn't enough. There was very little funds for the beneficiary, and the trustee didn't have assets that could be repaid, and we ended up filing a lien against the mother's property. A very, very strange circumstance where we filed a lien against her property. If she ever sold her house, then those funds would be recovered. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. Let me show you another example of a case that I've worked with. In this case, we're going to call the perpetrator the alleged fraudster. In this case, because the person was never convicted, so they're alleged. And we're going to call him Albert. So the background on this case is there's an elderly woman, and she had significant assets. She had a lot of money, a lot of investments, a lot of real property, but she also had no close family. She didn't have parents living any longer. She didn't have spouse or children or siblings that were still living. She had nobody close to her watching, and she kind of started to decline physically and a little bit mentally. And she recognized that and sought some help. She tried to get some help. So she got in touch with an estate planning attorney who we're calling Albert. He got involved, did some estate planning with her. He began to help her with her home. He began to help her pay her bills, in addition to the will and trust to protect some of the funds and what did she want when she's gone. But he also began to help her with some of her daily stuff. He hired a caregiver to help take care of her because she needed that assistance. Ultimately, she went into an assisted living center for a while, but she had a caregiver in the home for a while. So that's kind of her background. That's kind of the background in this case. So the facts that within this case, Albert kind of started to assert himself personally into the estate planning documents. Typically, when an attorney drafts estate planning documents, when they set up a trust or they decide to help the person get a power of attorney, they often shy away from doing any of that themselves. They'd rather have some other person be the trustee or some other person be the power of attorney, the POA. In this case, Albert put himself in those positions of authority, and he started to take over the financial transactions for this elderly woman, and he began to put himself on the checking account and write all of the checks, including checks to himself as for fees. He kind of took over all of her financial life. He took care of her home. He actually moved into her home at a point when she went to an assisted living. He moved into her home to care for it, and used the trust funds to basically fund the housing that he was benefiting from. He also hired caregivers, as I mentioned, and they took care of this elderly woman and helped her with her physical needs. So the way this particular case was discovered, remember, there's no family watching, and that's probably why Albert became kind of so bold. Just backing up a little bit, again, there's vacations involved where multiple people were taken on a vacation. Money was spent um, for football tickets, for travel, for cars, for repairs and maintenance on cars that weren't owned by the beneficiary. But Albert hired a caregiver, and the way that this was discovered initially is that the caregiver noticed that there were some really odd things going on with the way that the attorney was spending money. Now, the caregiver didn't have access to, checkbooks or to bank statements or anything like that, but this caregiver did notice that something was a little bit odd. And then a couple of nieces, there were some sisters who were nieces to this woman. They came to visit from out of state. It had been several years since they'd seen their aunt. They were visiting, and the caregiver confided in them some of the concerns that she was having. At this point, they didn't know, if there was fraud going on. They didn't know the extent of any potential fraud. They didn't know the details of any transactions. They just knew something was off. The caregiver, for example, received a bonus, an extremely large bonus at the end of the year that was inconsistent with the level of money that a caregiver would normally be paid. And that was a big red flag to this caregiver. When the nieces were visiting their aunt, she was at this point in an assisted living center. The caregiver would still come and assist from time to time, take her on outings and things like that. And they went through her mail and found some bank statements, the nieces did, and discovered in that some really odd financial transactions and things that didn't make sense to them. Again, this is key to something we're going to talk about later, which is that often it's a gut feeling or just something is off and you can't identify it. The person who notices it doesn't really know what the problem is. They just have identified that there's a problem. And they decide to ask questions and get into that. So the nieces hired a different probate attorney to look into this a little bit more. And that's when the discovery, that's how this was discovered. So the resolution is, in this particular case, the new attorney decided to have a capacity evaluation done on this woman. So she met with the doctor, and the doctor determined that she had some capacity issues. That was taken to court, and the court determined that the capacity issues were significant enough to appoint a guardian and conservator over her. So that's when our firm became involved. We were appointed as guardian or as conservator, not as guardian. But another company was appointed as the guardian, and we were also appointed as the trustee over some trust funds as well. And the court ordered us to do a look back for 3 years, do a forensic accounting, and see what we could find. And we went through and we found, as I mentioned earlier, we found large travel spending. We found fast food was one that was that I see kind of often, but in this case it was particularly incredible. There would be fast food purchases that were clearly more than what one person would eat, and you would see these 2 or 3 times a day often. There were donations. That was kind of an interesting one, is Albert would use the trust funds to make donations in his own name, really large charitable donations. Perhaps there was some ego there. I couldn't say exactly what the motivation was. So we prepared the 3-year forensic accounting. We took it back to the court, and the court did remove the attorney, earlier on from all of this financial authority, but the court did not rule any on misuse of funds or any kind of funds that would need to be returned. these types of things are very difficult to prove in a court, and often you'll find that the police don't want to get involved always with these things. In this case, the police were involved. You'll find often that the DA's office, the district attorney's office, does not want to prosecute. And you'll find that the courts are very hesitant to rule on these types of cases. And the reason for that is that often your victim is not mentally competent at the time. And so becomes a he said, she said type of environment where you have a victim that can't really testify, that can't say, this is what I feel and this is what I think. And the perpetrator, grandma told me I could take this money, or my client, in this case, Albert, the attorney, my client told me to do this. And we can all do what we want with our money, whether it's wise or not. We're allowed to make those decisions. And when there's nobody to testify to say, no, I didn't want him to do this, it often the courts, the fact that this made it to court is pretty significant. But the court did not rule any kind of a criminal misuse and didn't order any funds returned, but did remove the attorney. So the new attorney filed a complaint with the Utah Bar Association, and ultimately the original trustee and the original estate planning attorney was disbarred for a period of time. I don't recall if it was permanent or if there was a temporary time, but at least in this case, the attorney was put in a position where he could no longer do that to another person. And in this case, it's also relevant that there were two factors that assisted with it getting to that point. One is that the victim had significant financial assets, lots of money. The other thing is the interested parties in her guardianship and conservatorship and the beneficiaries of her trust, and ultimately the beneficiaries of her estate, were these three nieces. And they were on board with spending whatever money it took to resolve this situation. As a trustee or as a conservator, we can't just say, well, this is a bad situation, we're going to blow all this money going after this case, because it's not ours to do. Our duty is to conserve those funds for the care of the person. And ultimately, there's often beneficiaries that will receive that money, and we need to make sure that we're protecting the assets for them as well. But in this case, the beneficiaries wanted that money spent in this way. And so that's my second case that I wanted to go through. Those are the kinds of things that I see on a regular basis, and hopefully some of you, particularly those of you from Adult Protective Services, hopefully some of you that are caregivers or that work at care centers have seen, are seeing some similar things. These examples I'm sharing are familiar to you. Not hopefully that it happens, but hopefully you identify the same kinds of things. Oh, there we go. All right. So what are your responsibilities as a caregiver or as a person who works with seniors regularly? What are your responsibilities, and what are some strategies you can use to intervene when there is alleged financial abuse? The first thing is to be observant. Remember, in both of those cases, somebody was just watching. Somebody was noticing that things were happening. They couldn't put their thumb on it. They couldn't identify it, but they knew something was happening. And the second item is to question it. And I'll go into that a little bit more in just a minute. And then report it. There's actually law. We'll read the law here in just a moment. There's law if you suspect some elder abuse of any kind, including financial, you are legally required to report that. And then perhaps most important to all of this is to continue to observe, not just make the report and then you walk away from it. On observing, I've just noticed that fraud is most commonly discovered when somebody notices changes, when something is different than it used to be, when spending patterns are different, when behavior is different. That's when it kind of, our spidey senses come up and we notice, hey, something's not right here. When you just meet a person for the first time, we don't know their personality, we don't know their history. It's hard for us to tell that something's wrong, but over time, over a span of time, when we see things change, that's when we can start to identify that there's a problem. So we want to observe how things change for our clients and how things change for the people we care for. The second item, to question. Don't be afraid to ask questions about things that don't make sense. We know that, often seniors, sometimes they have some assets, sometimes they have some life experiences that are different than ours, and sometimes they do things that we might consider a little weird or a little quirky. We spend money in ways that don't make sense to us. We had a client that loved to gamble. He would spend tons of money gambling. And on one hand, I might make a personal judgment about whether or not that's a wise way to use money, but that's not relevant. It's his money to spend the way he wants. And it's okay to ask questions and find out, is this normal? Is this something you do? Is this something historical for you, that is a way that you spend money? It might not make sense to me. It might be a little quirky, but it's still okay. But over time, you'll start to notice things that are out of place. And again, you need time and to observe some changes is when you'll notice that something's not quite right. So when we notice that something's not right, and we're pretty confident that something that needs to be looked into, we have a duty to report it. In Utah code, it states that if an individual believes that a vulnerable adult is being exploited, that you have a duty, the individual shall immediately report the suspected abuse or exploitation. And you can report that to Adult Protective Services or to law enforcement. But we have a duty to do that. And of course, not just a legal duty, we also have a moral duty. And those of you that have had to do that, even not just Adult Protective Services, it's a similar situation with Child Protective Services. Sometimes you don't really know if there's a problem. Gosh, should I report this? Should I not report this? If you're having that feeling that it needs to be reported, then it probably needs to be reported. Once it's reported, you're not making judgment whether something actually happened or didn't actually happen, because you don't know. But at least you've put it out there. And then I also want to mention, remember the last item there was to continue to observe. After you've reported something, continue to observe, because there could be additional changes or additional information. When somebody calls the police because there's some weird behavior for their neighbor, whether it's an adult situation like this or not, it's very difficult for the police to just walk in. It's also very difficult for Adult Protective Services to just walk in and say, oh, we got this one report, we're going to shut this down. They aren't going to be able to take action as easily without observing a pattern or observing some very hard evidence. So continue to observe and report multiple times. I have a person in my life that I believe is experiencing elder abuse. And I have called Adult Protective Services a handful of times on this person, on this person's behalf. And over time, a case is being built, and over time, there's things that can, more of a case can happen. So continue to observe, continue to report, and consult with others around, see if they notice the same thing. Of course, as we do that, we're going to comply with HIPAA laws. We wouldn't necessarily, consult openly everything we know about a client with family members, but certainly we can discuss with them whether or not things are off to them as well. I'm kind of getting shorter on time. Some of the agencies that can help, I'll just kind of let you look through that list. Obviously, Adult Protective Services. Social Security has a representative payee program where if somebody can't handle their own Social Security funds, a representative payee who reports directly to Social Security can be put in place. The VA has similar programs, their fiduciary program. Estate planning attorneys are good resources as well. Okay, the last item, and I'll try to wrap this up really quick so we have time for some questions, is avoiding financial elder abuse. It's very helpful to understand exactly psychologically, what causes somebody to commit fraud. And in the fraud world, we have what we call the fraud triangle. And I'm just going to gloss over this for a minute. But basically, there's 3 items that need to happen in order for somebody to commit fraud. One is they have to have an opportunity. They have to be in a position of trust or have an opportunity to touch or manage that person's funds. The second item is they've got to have some sort of a pressure on them. If they perceive that there's a pressure that they have, a financial pressure that they just can't handle on their own, and they've got to resolve this some other way, that's something that will help lead to fraud. And the third item is rationalization. The person has to be able to rationalize in their own mind that this is okay to do. Maybe the person has lots and lots of money, and so it's not going to hurt them. Maybe this company I'm stealing from has lots of money, and it's not going to hurt them in any way. And they have to perceive that that's the case, and they also need to perceive that nobody is watching very closely. In both of these cases, nobody was watching very closely, at least as far as the perpetrator perceived. And so if you have those three things, so think about those things, and not just for other people, but for yourself as well. As a CFE, I'm in a position, and in my business, my company that I work for, Stag Fiduciary Services, I'm in a position where I hold a position of trust, and I have to be aware constantly, and we do in the firm, we have to put controls in place to make sure that these 3 items can never come together at the same time. And we have to look at ourselves introspectively constantly to make sure that we're not at risk of either committing a fraud, or better, even more so, being accused of that. Because even if you're not doing it, when these 3 things are all together, you could be. Then the second part, this will be the last thing, and then we'll go to questions, is transparency. To help avoid financial elder abuse, there's got to be transparency. A person doesn't, an elderly person or anybody does not typically decline immediately. There's not just a light switch. Sometimes in the public we think of Alzheimer's or or other mental incapacities. We think of them in society as a switch happened. Oh, he's got Alzheimer's, so now the lights off. And as you all know, working with seniors, that's not the case at all. It typically happens over time. Typically, a decline is fairly slow, and so we want to put some things in place, open up the transparency early on. Typically, somebody, when they handle their own financial life, they don't share their bank statements with their family members. I don't share my bank statement with my kids. I don't share it with a lot of people, but as we begin to decline, some of these conversations need to have. Family and close people should be able to see what's going on. The more transparent, the better. Having the bank send duplicate statements to multiple parties is a good thing. Reduce the complexity. If you've got 6 or 7 bank accounts and some credit cards and some investments, it's hard for those around you to know what's going on, and therefore it's harder for them to notice if there's a problem. And family needs to communicate. And as caregivers, obviously as a caregiver, you wouldn't have the authority to have somebody's bank statements, but these are just things that can certainly be suggested to family. And just communication is key. Remember that rationalization part of the fraud triangle, and a big part of it is assuming that nobody is watching and nobody's looking. And that's when you really open yourself up to accusations of fraud or actual fraud. So I believe I've got about 6-7 minutes left, moderators. Is that correct? If so, I'd like to be happy to take some questions.
You've got about 6 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. I've just had the presentation up. I didn't see if any questions had been typed. Have I missed any questions?
I haven't had any yet. So
Okay.
if you want to type some in, we can ask.
Switch to stop sharing so I can see the question panel.
Actually, I
Okay.
noticed someone is asking about a copy of the Safe and Smart pamphlets, like how to obtain them.
Yeah, on the state's Aging and Adult Services website, there is a resources tab, and that pamphlet is on there, is in there under resources. It is called Safe and Smart: Protecting Yourself from Financial Exploitation and Scams. It's about a 15-page document. I'll read the question so you know what I'm talking about. You mentioned that the courts don't like to get involved. So does it just become a family issue at that point? Sometimes it does. I'll be honest, in our position, sometimes we try to allow family members to believe that there's more of a danger of court involvement than there really is. And sometimes we can settle a case for a client by putting an end at least to the fraud. Sometimes we can get people to sign a settlement agreement to return some funds if we feel that there's a problem. But yeah, family or neighbors or whoever has authority. If the person's compromised mentally, if the person is becoming incapacitated, the courts will get involved in that. But as far as a criminal part, it's very difficult. I tried looking for the pamphlet and could not find it. Let me see if I can find a link. Is there a way for me to share information after the fact, moderators? Find the link and send that out?
We could find out. So
Okay, I'm just gonna kind of be on another screen here and see if I can find the link for you. Next question, very informative, thanks, you're welcome. Karina, who can I consult or refer my client to if they have any questions? If they have questions of me personally or of my company, I assume my contact information has been provided to the participants. Is that right?
Is it included within your PowerPoint?
It's not. I'll put my email on there real quick. Give me just a minute. I'm grabbing that link. I probably should have done this beforehand. I'm on a different screen, so if there's other questions that pop up, if you wouldn't mind reading them to me.
That's no problem. It said that somebody gave a link, arp.org, ThankSafe, and some other links.
Okay.
And then there was a
Does that link work?
das.utah.gov. There's another
Okay,
link.
good, yes. All right, thank you for finding those links and sharing them for me.
And then there was a drive, google.com, a smart and safe and smart link.
Okay, good. There must be aging and adult services employees that knew exactly where that was. Thank you for that. I'll just type my there's my email address. Is it not sent? It's not letting me send it. My email is rtolman, TOLMAN @stagfs.com, and stag is spelled STAGG. F is in Frank, S is in Sam.com. Is that? I just typed it in the Q&A box, but it's not letting me put that up there. Yeah, so if anybody has questions after the fact, or if they want to make a referral for a consultation or something, that's fine, but.
Well,
Any
Ron,
other-
we have reached the end of our session
Okay,
of the Utah Elder Justice Conference, and I want to thank everybody for attending the Identifying and Resolving Elder Finance Abuse session. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you, Ron. Thank you,
Thank you.
attendees.